Because of her age, the elderly woman was used to having her closest relatives having their own affairs, and they rarely came to visit. This day was special for the old lady because she turned 80 years old. Her relatives could not forget such a date. Mrs. Paulson baked her signature apple pie and proceeded to set the table. She made treats for her beloved grandchildren, Jack and Paul. Of course, her cousins could have come too, but she had arthritis and was practically bedbound. The boys arrived closer to noon, when everything was ready and the house was filled with the scent of fresh baked goods and cinnamon. After handing their grandmother a modest bouquet, Jack and Paul immediately went into the kitchen, where an apple pie awaited. Mrs. Paulson's grandchildren were used to their grandmother always taking care of them, paying for their university tuition, giving them money to buy cars, and always giving them non-refundable loans. In the past, the retiree had held management positions in many companies in the city and had become known as a serious and self-sufficient woman. When she retired, she hardly ever left the house. 7 years ago, her husband, Mr. Paulson, passed away and the old lady had been all alone ever since. That's why she was looking forward to her grandchildren, whose visit was a real holiday for her and probably the only joy in her life. Jack and Paul behaved strangely that day. Dropping their eyes in front of their grandmother, the young men quickly ate the cake, after which they got up from the table and began to look carefully around the house. They went into one room, and then another, and then they went through each and every corner. As they did, the boys wrote things down in a notebook and measured the walls and doors with a tape measure. The old woman thought they were renovating. Meanwhile, the grandchildren got to work. As it turned out, Mrs. Paulson's birthday was just an excuse for what the negligent grandchildren were planning. This was evident in their contented faces and the twinkle in their eyes, apparently driven by their desire for a quick profit. "Grandma, you probably guessed it. We want to make a little change in your life, and we think you'll like it." Paul was the first to break the long silence. "Are you freshening up the decor for me?" the older woman answered cautiously. At that moment, the young people looked at each other and then began to pack Grandma's things in a suitcase. After putting Grandma in the car, Paul started the engine and they drove off. Still not understanding what was going on, Mrs. Paulson stared tensely out of the window. The whole trip seemed so strange to her that she didn't know whether to be happy about it or to start panicking. She trusted her boys, but where could they be taking her on her anniversary? The trip took quite a while. Drowsy with the rhythmic hum of the engine, Grandma did not notice how she fell into a nap. She remembered with a smile her past life, when, as a little girl, she had enjoyed every day of her life. At the time, everything seemed so fabulous and beautiful that Mrs. Paulson thought she was Alice in Wonderland. When the track ended, the car began to shake involuntarily. As it turned out, they were driving on a dirt road leading to a 3-story building that looked like a massive gray block from the outside. Mrs. Paulson had never been to this place and could not imagine why they had come here. As her grandson drove closer, the old lady tensioned and her heart pounded frantically. In the courtyard in front of the building, elderly people were walking around, dressed in almost identical robes and pajamas. "Nursing home? Why, I can handle my own anxiety," she thought. The realization of the terrible truth wounded at the very heart, which caused an attack of tachycardia. Only now she understood the intention of her grandchildren. The ungrateful ones had simply decided to get rid of their own grandmother in a completely legal but immoral way. "They will probably sell the house. That's why they've been measuring it for a long time," Mrs. Paulson pondered sadly. As Jack carried Grandma's things into the building, Paul helped her out of the car. "You'll be better off here, Grandma. There are nurses and doctors working on the property. You'll see how comfortable and cozy this place is," said the eldest grandson. Mrs. Paulson shook her head, but obediently followed her grandson. The necessary papers were quickly filled out. Her word no longer mattered. She simply sat back in her chair and watched with undisguised sadness as her beloved grandchildren decided everything for her. The whole procedure lasted about half an hour, after which Jack and Paul hesitantly said goodbye and hurried to the exit as if they wanted to leave the scene as soon as possible. And the abandoned old lady had come to terms with reality and accepted what awaited her. Mrs. Paulson's roommates turned out to be rather nice people who, though they suffered from memory problems and insomnia, did not cause much discomfort. The first night, the old lady, as expected, could not sleep. Sitting on the hard bed, she cried and could not believe that her grandchildren had done this to her. After all, she knew perfectly well that she could do without additional help for a long time. The main thing is that in her own home. But her grandchildren had it differently. A week went by like that. The days dragged on endlessly. A strict daily routine that included breakfast, lunch, and dinner, personal time, watching television, and walking in the fresh air. Everything seemed fine, but the old lady longed for her former life and even for her grandchildren, who turned out to be traitors in the end. Not only did they not visit their grandmother, but they did not even deign to call her to inquire about her state of health. After a second week in the nursing home, grandmother did not remember her beloved grandchildren, but they did not care to visit her in person. They passed food and clothing through a carrier who was generously paid. He, of course, was surprised why the boys did not want to visit their grandmother in person. Andrew had grown up in an orphanage and had been deprived of the warmth and family home and parental love from an early age. So if he had a single soul close to him, he would never leave her or refuse to help her. On the other hand, he had no right to judge Jack and Paul, who had made their decision. After buying a whole bag of fruit and sweets, the man went to the nursing home. Although Mrs. Paulson saw the visitor for the first time, she treated him with respect and warmth. She rejoiced at his attention because she saw the kindness in which he treated her. They chatted for hours, and if it were not for dinner, most likely their talk would have lasted until late at night. The next day, Andrew, the same carrier, came again, but on his own initiative. To the man's amazement, his conversations with Mrs. Paulson gave him a very pleasant emotion, which he had never had before, and the abandoned old lady was happy for Andrew's visits because he turned out to be an extremely polite, intelligent, and pleasant guy. At some point, the nursing home staff began to treat the visitor as Mrs. Paulson's grandson. From her heartfelt conversations with Andrew, the elderly woman learned that he loved animals more than anything and dreamed of building a specialized center for them, but that he did not yet have the money to carry out his plan. The woman thought about it day and night. One day, during Andrew's regular visit, the old woman suddenly asked a passing worker for a piece of paper and pen. The man was surprised to read what the old woman had written. The piece of paper had the address where the abandoned garage was located. It was on the same street as Mrs. Paulson's house. The grandchildren did not know of the existence of the garage, which once again surprised Andrew. The boy found the place and had to take a green metal box from there and store it for the owner of that garage. He complied with the request and took the strange object to his home. He noticed that the box weighed at least 20 kilograms, and it was also closed and there were no keys to it. The next morning, Andrew got up earlier than usual to see Mrs. Paulson as soon as possible. When he arrived at the nursing home, however, very sad news awaited him. "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Paulson was gone last night. The only thing she asked me to do was to give you this key," the nurse on duty said in a shaky voice. As he took the key, Andrew didn't even notice the tears rolling from his eyes. Automatically slipping the key into his pocket, he headed for the exit. At that moment, his heart was ready to jump out of his chest because of the excruciating pain of losing someone already close to him. The man had taken care of the funeral because Mrs. Paulson's grandchildren hadn't made time for it this time either. This was one of the most difficult times for Andrew. Just a week after the funeral, the man remembered the key the old lady had left for him. When the guy opened the box, he could not believe his eyes. Inside lay a large amount of gold and silver jewelry. There were so many it made him dizzy at the thought of their value. "Thank you, Mrs. Paulson. I won't let you down," Andrew whispered with tears in his eyes. He realized that the caring old lady wanted to help him realize his dream, and about 6 months later, Andrew opened a homeless animal rescue and rehabilitation center. He named it after the late Mrs. Paulson, who left a mark on his heart forever. As he looked up into the sky, the man was sure the kind old lady was watching him and wishing him good luck, and a sign next to her house lit up that read, "Welcome to our home."